They came like thunder, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. From the windswept plains of Mongolia, a tide of horsemen surged forth, led by a man whose name would strike fear into empires. Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. No walls could stop them, no army could match their speed. One day, the world did not know the Mongols. The next, cities burned. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire stood as the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the shores of Korea to the edges of Hungary, from the forests of Siberia to the sands of Arabia. It had been forged in fire, terror, and brilliant strategy. But beneath the ash, something new had begun to grow. Trade flourished as never before. The Silk Road, once fragmented and dangerous, was now protected by Mongol patrols. Goods, ideas, and people moved with unprecedented speed. Chinese porcelain reached Italy. Persian doctors treated patients in China. Venetian merchants like Marco Polo would soon ride these same roads, marveling at what they saw. The Mongols imposed a harsh but efficient order. They valued skill, regardless of origin. Engineers from Persia, scribes from China, warriors from every corner of their empire. They tolerated religions, unified currencies, and enforced strict laws. Even after the great conquests ended, their impact reshaped entire civilizations. But peace under the Mongols was not peace as the world had known. It had been bought with fire and bone. The old world had been shattered. In 1241, the Mongol storm rolled into the heart of Europe. Two great armies moved with terrifying coordination, one aimed at Hungary, the other at Poland. Their arrival marked a nightmare Europe had never imagined. In Poland, the Mongols crushed a coalition of knights at the Battle of Legnica. European heavy cavalry, long believed invincible, was shattered by superior mobility and tactics. Duke Henry the Pious fell in battle, and his severed head was displayed on a spear. Simultaneously, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai entered Hungary. King Bela IV had gathered a vast army, but he underestimated his enemy. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, the Mongols struck with surgical precision. While the Hungarians camped on open plains, Subutai flanked them with a hidden bridge and trapped them in a deadly pincer. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. The Hungarian kingdom lay open, its towns and villages burned, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Europe trembled. Rome, Vienna, and Paris feared they were next. No Christian army had withstood the Mongols, no fortress seemed strong enough. In 1241, the Mongol storm rolled into the heart of Europe. Two great armies moved with terrifying coordination, one aimed at Hungary, the other at Poland. Their arrival marked a nightmare Europe had never imagined. In Poland, the Mongols crushed a coalition of knights at the Battle of Legnica. European heavy cavalry, long believed invincible, was shattered by superior mobility and tactics. Duke Henry the Pious fell in battle, and his severed head was displayed on a spear. Simultaneously, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai entered Hungary. King Bela IV had gathered a vast army, but he underestimated his enemy. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, the Mongols struck with surgical precision. While the Hungarians camped on open plains, Subutai flanked them with a hidden bridge and trapped them in a deadly pincer. The result was catastrophic. Tens of thousands died. The Hungarian kingdom lay open, its towns and villages burned, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Europe trembled. Rome, Vienna, and Paris feared they were next. No Christian army had withstood the Mongols, no fortress seemed strong enough. With Genghis Khan gone, the world held its breath, but the Mongol Empire did not falter. Power passed to his third son, Ögedei, as the Great Khan, chosen by his father and confirmed by the Great Kurultai. The empire was not just held together, it expanded. Ögedei was different from his father, less of a warrior, more of a ruler, but he was no less ambitious. He continued the war against the Jin dynasty in China and ordered new campaigns into Korea, the Middle East, and, most significantly, Europe. Under Ögedei, the Mongol administration flourished. Roads were rebuilt, postal stations established, and taxation made more efficient. The yam system allowed for swift communication across thousands of miles. Trade flourished, and cities once burned were now repopulated and taxed. But Ögedei's true strength was delegation. He empowered his brothers and nephews. Jochi's sons, Batu and Orda, were sent west, while Tului's sons, like Monka and Kublai, began preparing campaigns in Asia. The sons of the Khan were no longer just inheritors, they were instruments of expansion. The Pax Mongolica had not yet begun. First, the world would burn a little longer. Long after the last arrow was loosed and the last city razed, the echo of the Mongol hooves still thundered through history. Genghis Khan and his descendants did not just carve an empire, they redrew the map of the known world. Dynasties rose and fell in their shadow. The Russian principalities were forever reshaped under Mongol rule. The Islamic world, once dominant, reeled from the shock. In China, the Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, ruled as Mongols sat on the dragon throne. Even after the empire fractured into khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Yuan, the influence remained. Military tactics, trade routes, diplomatic customs, and even postal systems bore their mark. To some, the Mongols were butchers, destroyers of culture and cities. To others, they were unifiers, harsh but visionary rulers who linked distant worlds. Their story is one of contradiction, savagery and tolerance, destruction and innovation, death and rebirth. The Mongol invasions were not just a chapter in history, they were a turning point, a moment when the world was cracked open, and from its fractured pieces, a new global order emerged. With Khwarezm in ruins and Jalal ad-Din driven into exile, Genghis Khan looked north and west. His wrath had not cooled, it only expanded. Now his gaze turned toward the Caucasus, where mountains met empires and new enemies waited. He dispatched two of his finest generals, Subutai and Jebe, with a small, elite force. Their mission: pursue fleeing Khwarezmian forces, gather intelligence, and test the strength of unknown lands. But this was no simple reconnaissance. The Mongols stormed through the Caucasus like fire through dry grass. They clashed with the Georgians and Armenians, defeating heavily armored knights with maneuver and precision. Their tactics were unmatched. Feigned retreats, ambushes, and lightning raids left enemy commanders bewildered. In 1223, the Mongols descended from the mountains into the steppes of southern Russia. There, they met a new coalition, the Kievan Rus and the Cumans. The great battle would come soon, but even now, the message was clear. The Mongols were not bound by mountains, deserts, or distance. No border was sacred, no kingdom too far. This was not just an invasion, it was a probe. A whisper in the wind that something greater, darker, and more organized was coming from the east. In 1223, the armies of the Rus's princes and their Cuman allies assembled to stop the Mongol advance. They believed they faced a small raiding party, far from home and vulnerable. What they didn't understand was that the Mongols, under Subutai and Jebe, were already 3 steps ahead. For days, the Mongols lured the Rus deep into the steppe, faking retreat after retreat. The coalition, bloated and disorganized, marched blindly into a trap. When they finally reached the Kalka River, they found not a fleeing enemy, but a waiting army. The Mongols struck with surgical precision. Their horse archers encircled and confused. Their heavy cavalry shattered the Rus' flanks. Panic spread, units fled or were cut down where they stood. What began as a campaign of confidence ended in massacre. Many princes were captured alive, but the Mongols didn't ask for ransom. Instead, they laid the leaders under wooden boards and held a victory feast on top of them, crushing them slowly beneath the weight of their enemies' celebration. It was not just death, it was humiliation. After the slaughter, the Mongols did not stay. They vanished into the east as suddenly as they had come. But the west had been warned. By 1218, Genghis Khan had crushed the northern Chinese frontier and turned west, seeking trade, not war. He sent a caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a rich Islamic state spanning modern-day Iran and Central Asia. The caravan carried silk, gold, and peaceful intent, but it never returned. The governor of Otrar, suspecting spies, seized the goods and executed the merchants. Outraged, Genghis sent envoys demanding justice. The Shah of Khwarezm, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, made a fatal choice. He beheaded one envoy and humiliated the others. Genghis Khan was not a man to forgive insult. In 1219, he unleashed his full fury. Over 100,000 Mongol warriors thundered westward. Cities that had stood for centuries, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, were reduced to ash. The Mongols struck with precision and ruthlessness. They diverted rivers, burned granaries, and left pyramids of skulls as warnings. The Shah fled, hounded across deserts and mountains until he died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea. Khwarezm had underestimated the Khan, mistaking trade for weakness. That mistake cost them their empire. To the west, the Islamic world trembled. To the east, even China grew silent. The Mongols had crossed a new line, one of vengeance, empire, and total annihilation. Long before he was Genghis Khan, he was simply Temujin, a boy born into hunger, danger, and exile. His father, Yesugai, a tribal chieftain, was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was just 9. In the harsh Mongolian steppe, that meant death, not just for the father, but for the family. Betrayed by their own clan, Temujin, his mother Hurlun, and his siblings were left to starve. They dug roots from frozen earth and hunted rats to survive. But hardship forged steel in the boy. He watched, learned, and endured. Where others would have broken, Temujin plotted, he would never forget those who abandoned him, nor would he forgive. As he grew, he gained allies, not through birthright, but through loyalty. He understood that unity was power. Brotherhood, even across tribal lines, could challenge the old ways. One by one, he gathered warriors who believed not in his blood, but in his vision. It was here, on the edge of despair, that Temujin began to shape his destiny. A future Khan born not in palaces, but among wolves and frost. The boy who had once eaten wild berries to survive was already dreaming of a world ruled by one hand, his own. The first to feel the weight of Genghis Khan's ambition was the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China. Rich, arrogant, and unprepared, the Jin had long looked down on the Mongols as barbaric nomads, but that would prove a fatal mistake. In 1211, Genghis launched his campaign. His army was swift and relentless, striking across mountain passes and forested plains. The Great Wall, once thought impenetrable, was bypassed with cunning. Mongol scouts found hidden paths, bribed frontier guards, and used local knowledge to dismantle the illusion of safety, brick by brick. The Jin armies were massive but slow, bound by rigid hierarchy and poor coordination. Against them came horse archers who moved like wind, striking from afar, vanishing, then returning like ghosts. Cities fell, one by one. Refugees streamed south, spreading terror ahead of the Mongol advance. By 1215, the Mongols reached Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. After a brutal siege, the city was taken, sacked, and burned. The wealth of centuries was plundered in days. But Genghis Khan was not driven by gold alone. This war was a message. No wall, no army, no empire was beyond his reach. The era of the Mongols had begun, and nowhere was safe. If Bukhara was a warning, Samarkand was a lesson. The city was a marvel. Fortified walls, gleaming minarets, and a garrison of 100,000 men. It was the pride of the Khwarezmian Empire, a place believed too grand, too strong to fall. But when Genghis Khan's forces approached in 1220, terror had already arrived before them. The Mongols surrounded the city with ruthless precision. They cut off supplies, poisoned wells, and launched wave after wave of assaults. The defenders, though numerous, were disorganized. Discipline broke. Many within Samarkand surrendered early, hoping for mercy. But mercy from the Mongols was rare. Samarkand fell. Its soldiers were slaughtered, the nobility was executed, artisans were spared and sent east. Genghis Khan had no interest in ruling broken cities, only in breaking them. Before the fires consumed the mosques and markets, the Khan paraded captured soldiers before the survivors, driving home one truth: resistance was suicide. The fall of Samarkand shattered the illusion of Khwarezmian strength. City after city now opened its gates in fear, not defiance. The Mongol tide could not be stopped. It devoured everything in its path. Kiev, once the heart of the Kievan Rus, a beacon of Orthodox Christianity and Slavic pride, faced its darkest hour in 1240. Batu Khan's army, fresh from its conquests of the Rus' principalities, arrived at Kiev's gates with one goal: complete destruction. The defenders, led by Prince Dmitro, refused to surrender. They believed in their walls, their faith, and their city's divine protection. The Mongols responded with brutal efficiency. They surrounded the city, severed supply lines, and brought siege engines to bear. For weeks, fire and stone rained upon Kiev. When the breaches finally came, Mongol warriors poured through, killing everything in their path. Monks were slain at their altars, churches were torched, families were cut down in the streets. By the time the smoke cleared, Kiev no longer resembled a city. Of its estimated 50,000 inhabitants, only a few thousand remained alive. The Mongols did not simply conquer, they erased. But the fall of Kiev was not just the end of a city. It was the beginning of a new era, the subjugation of Eastern Europe under Mongol rule. The Rus would not rise again for generations. In 1227, as the Mongols laid siege to the western Xia once more, a shadow fell across the empire, not from an enemy, but from fate itself. Genghis Khan, the scourge of empires, the unifier of the steppes, had fallen ill. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery. Some say he was thrown from his horse. Others whisper of an assassin's blade or illness brought by age and exhaustion. Whatever the truth, it was kept secret at first. Not even his generals knew. The war had to continue. Only after Western Xia was obliterated, its cities burned, its people scattered, did the Mongols begin to mourn. Genghis Khan's body was taken back to Mongolia under deep secrecy. Along the route, all who saw the funeral procession were killed to preserve the mystery. He was buried in an unmarked grave near the sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain. No monument, no tombstone, only legend. But though the man had died, his storm had not passed. His sons and grandsons inherited more than land. They inherited a vision of domination. Genghis Khan's last words to his heirs were simple: if you want to keep the empire, conquer more. After years of bloodshed across Central Asia, Persia, and the Caucasus, Genghis Khan turned his army homeward. His empire had exploded across continents, but the campaign was not endless. There were rebellions to crush, territories to secure, and succession to consider. By 1225, the Mongols were marching back east. Cities like Nishapur and Herat, which had dared to resist, were punished again, some reduced to dust, their populations annihilated. Genghis Khan's vengeance was patient. He never forgot defiance. But his gaze was also fixed on China. The Western Xia and remnants of the Jin dynasty still stood, stubbornly resisting Mongol domination. These old enemies would soon face the fury of a battle-hardened empire. As he traveled eastward, Genghis reorganized what he had conquered. He appointed loyal generals, installed Mongol administrators, and secured trade routes along the Silk Road. Persian scholars were brought to Mongol courts. Engineers from China were resettled in the west. The destruction he wrought had paved the way for a new order, a connected, obedient world under Mongol control. Yet for all the victories, time was catching up with the Great Khan. How did a scattered group of nomadic clans become the most terrifying military force the world had ever seen? It began with unification. Through cunning alliances, brutal warfare, and unrelenting will, Genghis bound the Mongol tribes under one banner. He forged a new kind of army, disciplined, mobile, and merciless. But this was no ordinary conquest. It was a reckoning. From China to the Caspian Sea, from icy Siberia to Persian deserts, they carved a path soaked in blood and ore. This is the story of the Mongol invasions, of fire and thunder, empire and ashes, a saga of ambition, terror and transformation, and it begins on the edge of the world, where the hooves first struck the earth. In 1206, under the endless sky, the Mongol tribes gathered for the greatest Kurultai in their history. No longer divided by clan or blood, they stood united under one leader, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The moment marked more than a title. It was the birth of an empire that would reshape the world. Genghis Khan wasted no time. He reorganized Mongol society from the ground up. No man could rise by birth alone, only by loyalty and skill. He broke down tribal loyalties and replaced them with a new military order, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, all sworn to the Khan. Laws were carved into the Yasa, an unwritten but strictly enforced code. Theft, betrayal, and cowardice were met with swift justice. Religious freedom was guaranteed, and meritocracy was the law of the land. In a world torn by chaos, Genghis offered order on his terms. But this unity was not the end. It was only the beginning. Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. The steppe was no longer enough. Beyond the mountains and deserts lay cities ripe with riches, kings blinded by pride, and empires too slow to react. Urgench was different. Unlike Bukhara and Samarkand, it refused to bow. Wealthy and defiant, the city stood at the heart of Khwarezm's trade and culture. Its markets overflowed with silk and gold. Its canals shimmered under the desert sun. But defiance came at a price. The Mongols besieged the city in 1221. They met fierce resistance, street by street, house by house. Unlike earlier campaigns, this siege dragged on for weeks. Genghis Khan even recalled one of his top generals, Joshi, his eldest son, to reinforce the assault. But tensions flared between Joshi and his brother Chagatai. Their rivalry threatened the campaign. Genghis intervened. To avoid discord, he replaced both sons with his trusted general Ogedei. The assault resumed with brutal efficiency. Finally, the gates fell. What followed was slaughter on a scale the world could scarcely comprehend. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands were killed. The canals that once fed fields were destroyed. The city's very lifeblood was cut. Not even the foundations were spared. Urgench ceased to exist, not just as a city, but as a memory. Power on the steppe was fragile, built on shifting alliances, family feuds, and sudden betrayals. Temujin knew this better than anyone. To rise, he needed more than strength. He needed loyalty stronger than blood. He found it in a childhood bond with a warrior named Jamukha. Sworn brothers under the sacred oath of Anda, they shared food, dreams, and battle scars. But as they grew older, their paths diverged. Temujin sought unity among all tribes, offering power to the humble. Jamukha clung to the nobility, to the old order. When the steppe demanded a leader, both men answered. The tribes split. Those seeking change followed Temujin. Those defending tradition rallied to Jamukha. It was a war not just of warriors, but of visions. Their clash came in 1187. Temujin's forces were smaller but disciplined, organized in units of 10, 100, 1,000. He struck like lightning and won, but the rivalry was not over. Years later, Jamukha returned with a massive force and crushed Temujin. He executed his prisoners in brutal fashion, boiling them alive. Temujin fled, but did not forget. The steppe had chosen its champions. Only one would rule, and in time, brotherhood would give way to empire. In late 1241, just as the Mongols stood poised to sweep deeper into Europe, news arrived that changed everything. Ogedei Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, was dead. The Great Khan's death triggered the ancient Mongol custom. All princes of Genghis's bloodline were required to return to Mongolia to attend the Kurultai, the council that would elect his successor. No campaign, no matter how successful, could continue until the question of leadership was settled. Batu Khan halted his advance. Though he controlled Hungary and had no rival in Europe, he turned back. Other Mongol leaders, including Subutai, reluctantly followed. It was not mercy that spared Europe. It was Mongol law. In the aftermath, Europe struggled to comprehend what had happened. Armies had been broken, cities erased, and kingdoms brought to their knees, all by a force that then vanished like mist. No army would again strike such terror across the continent. But the reprieve was temporary. The Mongols had not been defeated, they had simply paused, and the empire left behind in their wake still ruled from the Danube to the Pacific. Bukhara, jewel of the Silk Road, a center of Islamic learning and trade, never expected to fall. Its walls were strong, its people proud, and its scholars renowned. But in 1220, the thundering hooves of Genghis Khan's army arrived at its gates. The defenders, confident in their walls, mocked the invaders. But the Mongols didn't attack directly. They feigned retreat, drew out the garrison, and then encircled and destroyed them in the open steppe. With its defenders gone, Bukhara stood helpless. Genghis Khan entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a prophet of wrath. He walked into the Grand Mosque and addressed the trembling crowd. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me." Then, his army began its work. Homes were looted, libraries were burned, the city was set aflame, yet Genghis spared craftsmen and scholars, sending them east to serve the empire. He valued talent, but not resistance. Bukhara was left smoldering. The Silk Road's great pearl was now ash and silence. The world began to understand. This was no ordinary warlord. This was judgment on horseback, and his campaign had only begun.